Now, consent mode is a feature that's new for Google Analytics 4, but applies beyond just Google Analytics. This is a feature that's built within what's called the Google tag, or the ecosystem of Google tags. So that affects things like Google Ads, Google Analytics, and the Floodlight tags, or which is the DVSA and CM360 products. So what it's a way of doing is to mitigate or try to mitigate for when a user does not consent for either marketing or analytics cookies. We've all seen those cookie banners that appear on every website and app, which then asks for consent to set basically a device ID as storage onto the user's device. On a website, that's obviously a first-party cookie, which Google Analytics uses to identify the user. So every time the user goes from page to page or logs an event now, an event in 5 minutes, and an event 10 weeks from now, hopefully it all gets tied to the same user. And so we can do things like user journey analysis, we can look at attribution modeling, and we can really understand the sequence of events that are occurring per user. But what throws a real spanner in the works for doing that kind of reporting or analysis is when a user does not consent for this cookie or the app equivalent to be saved onto the device, which means then Google Analytics has no common ID to tie all of these disparate events that are occurring and being sent into the platform together, with no way of tying them to a session even, let alone a user. So Google have come up with this concept or this tool called consent mode. And this isn't a consent banner, by the way. Google doesn't have any visual banners or anything you can put on your website or app. This is a system that enables the Google tags to be fired, even if there is no consent for these cookies or device equivalents to be saved. And the reason this is a thing is because when a user consents or not consents to, let's call it just the cookie banner, right, on a website. If they don't consent to the analytics or advertising cookies, you don't need cookies to still track what's going on. Even looking far back as, the early days of the internet where there was some things called log files that still exist. But it's just counting. It's just counting a number of times a asset has been requested. For example, a page has been loaded or rendered on a device. So in a sense, Google Analytics 4 has a kind of log file side of it. So when a user doesn't consent, the events are still tracked in all their kind of event glory with all their event names and parameters. The only things that are missing is the user ID or the client ID we call it, which is what's saved in the cookie or the app version. So what happens there is that Google receives all these events, but it's got no way of tying them together, so we can't deduplicate. We can't deduplicate per user or per session. So what Google Analytics does is it doesn't send those into the interface. You can't see these events in the reporting interface, but it has this secondary system called behavioural modelling, and this is a machine learning model that enables Google to do some clever stuff to estimate the total number of sessions, users, revenue, clicks, downloads, those kind of things. So in a sense, it's kind of like a way to extrapolate with bits of known information about the unconsented users to kind of get a fuller data set so that at least you can maintain a semblance of year-on-year or month-on-month comparisons with your new data set post-cookie banners to beforehand, sort of when you tracked everything from everyone. I've just got a quick video that I'm just going to show here, just going through a talk that I've done before in the past, talking exactly around consent mode behavioural modelling with some pros and cons. So I think it's worth just having a quick look at that, and then we'll come back and discuss.
Behavioural modelling, this is something that's been rolled out right now. If you have GA4, you might not have even seen it. But this is where we have to introduce the whole concept of something called consent mode. So consent mode is another Google feature where when someone hasn't opted in to analytics storage cookies, you can still track data, right? Apparently.
I say apparently just because there is a general debate in the industry around whether or not consent mode is a valid system to use. If a user hasn't opted in, then there's an argument there that there should be no consent, no tracking. No consent, no tracking has got a big following, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong or which one you should be doing. But the consent mode system operates by tracking when there's no consent for the cookie. So think about it, that consent is given for cookies, right? Or for storing bits of information on the user's device. We're not using, or I suppose consent mode means you can still track. They're not consenting to not be tracked, they're consenting to not have a cookie stored. It's very, very subtle differences, and I think a lot of people would like it to be black and white in terms of no consent for any of it. Whereas I think the kind of technical and legal framework that Google is using here, using consent mode, is they're not consenting for cookies, but we can still do the other bits. So this is something to be discussed to your side, whether or not you agree with it, which side of the fence you sit on. But anyway, let's carry on.
But this is where you can't see the user journey. We can't track some data when users don't consent to analytics cookies. So this type of machine learning modeling is to fill in those gaps. So the rule is, if you don't consent, I can't track you, right? And so that creates gaps in data. So how am I going to do year-on-year comparisons, which everyone loves to see? You can't. So back to our pros and cons list.
Yes, this is a Star Trek themed presentation. So yes, the Riker on the left is the one with a beard, which is obviously the pros, and the Riker on the right is pre-beard, which is, I think, a con. Yeah, I'll link off to the full talk that I did on this if you want to watch the whole thing, and how I crowbarred an analogy of Star Trek into Google Analytics 4 for a long time. But anyway, back to this.
So the first pro of this kind of modeling is that it helps to maintain that year-on-year, month-on-month, pre-post cookie banner policy, right? So it helps to, maybe not to the majority of people sitting in this room, but it helps to, from an organization level, create some kind of continuity within data and trends at very least. The other thing is that it can be disabled, right? So you can opt in and out of this, and it's at the flick of a switch. You can just turn it off and on. It has no effect on historical future data. It's just an option you can toggle on and off.
This is really important, that even if you've gone to all the work to implement consent mode and it's all sort of done through your developers or Google Tag Manager, however you manage that, you don't have to use it. It's an option within Google Analytics 4 to then turn it off. So if you've done the implementation, you've got the choice. You can use consent mode, or you can use the behavioral modeling rather, or you can decide to just look at the consented user data. So you always have the choice with this, which is worth knowing.
However, consent mode, TM, it must be used in the tracking. So if you're using Google Tag Manager, if you're using the other Google products, it's baked into these things and you need to be looking at it. There is a question mark around the validity from a GDPR perspective of consent mode. How can you track if they haven't consented? It's like, well, you can. It's called a cookieless ping. So it sounds all friendly. But there is a feature called consent mode that you need to be using because it needs to model the data on something. Thresholds apply. And so it needs a lot of data actually at the moment. They've done a lot of work on the machine learning modeling over the years, especially around data-driven attribution, which we'll talk about momentarily, around how they can kind of reduce those minimum thresholds. But right now you need 1,000 opted in and 1,000 opted out and in each users per day.
All right, so yeah, just to go kind of recap that, the thresholding there is a blocker for a lot of people in terms of that. So as of right now, you need a lot of opted in and a lot of opted out users per day. So at least when I recorded this talk, it was 1,000 per day of each. I'll link off to the documentation so you can keep an eye on what the kind of current thresholds are. They do reduce them every now and then as the modeling gets better. They need less training data in a sense, with all these machine learning models. So yeah, it's just good to note that even if you go to all the work of implementing consent mode and you want to use behavioral modeling, you've turned it on, there might be a thresholding element where it won't work. It's just not enough information there for it to work for your apps or your website. But yeah, they're the pros and cons. It's a way to model out the difference of the unconsented users. But I already mentioned just before we watched the clip actually around BigQuery and how, well, I didn't mention BigQuery actually, but I'll mention it now. When inside of the Google Analytics 4 user interface, you don't get access to this unconsented event data. It's all kind of like disparate random floaty events that don't do anyone any help. That's why Google goes through this behavioral modeling process and kind of estimates in the kind of missing bits. However, if you've got your data, your GA4 property connected to BigQuery, if you're doing the daily exports and the streaming exports, you also get the unconsented event data too. So you get absolutely everything, all the raw data in BigQuery. And this is really, really useful because it enables you to do your own reporting or your own modeling. Even if you just want to get a sense of total page views or total screen views on your websites and apps, you can do that even if the user hasn't consented, because we're not looking at users, we're not looking at sessions, we're just looking at counting the events. And so you can still do that using the BigQuery connector. So just another kind of another reason why the BigQuery connector is super valuable to be set up. Even if you don't know anything about the Google Cloud Platform or using SQL to query the data, just get BigQuery set up right now. Your future self will thank you for it later on down the line when you do come to need it, inevitably come to need it. So yes, this is another reason for that. But anyway, that's machine learning modeling, that's behavioral modeling, at least part one of their machine learning models, and that's what consent mode is. Consent mode is just a mechanism of getting in user data where users haven't consented for the cookies or the app equivalents. And then behavioral modeling is what Google Analytics 4 does with that data. It starts to kind of then fill in those blank spots, assuming you hit a certain threshold. yeah, more on that in the video and more on that in the links in the description of this one. So enjoy reading up about that, and yeah, good luck.